Hi, welcome back to Metapunk Zero. I'm Andre, and in this episode, I'm going to do another installment of the Psychosis Diaries, this time talking about some lessons that I learned from my psychosis experiences. Please stay tuned. What did I learn from my psychosis? It's my assignment for my summer project. It's back to school, right? So what did I learn from my psychosis experience? Those lessons are really uncountable. Psychosis is a big and varied experience. It's nothing that you can really encapsulate in a few words, but there are a few things that really stick out, and I want to talk about those. So, yeah, it's kind of hard to know where to begin with this. The first thing that you learn in psychosis is that things are not what they appear to be. I mean, that's kind of that's a staple of a lot of metaphysical philosophy, staple of movies like The Matrix. It's a lot of what defines this channel and what I consider the genre of metapunk is the ontological mystery of what exactly is reality, and how do we know what's real? Those are important questions, and they are philosophical, but when you go into psychosis, it's not really a philosophical undertaking. It's more like a crash course in practical metaphysics, and maybe in the most generous possible language. That's how I would describe it. But it's a very visceral experience, and so you're not like intellectually wondering what's real. You are literally watching your reality fall apart around you. It's much more like a psychedelic experience that way. It's much more like being on LSD or mushrooms or something, where you can't even be sure that the chair you're sitting on is very real, but you're also not sure that you're separate from it. It's really complicated. Your thoughts and reality really overlap. Carl Jung talked about synchronicity, and I believe sort of a loose definition of synchronicity is when your internal states line up with external states. When external events sort of mirror what's going on internally, that's a synchronicity. And Jung believed a lot in those sorts of things. Jung was a very open-minded guy and had a lot of metaphysical implications of the psychology that he was talking about. And so synchronicities were important to him. They signified something important psychologically. It was a way in which reality was reflecting back to you what was going on inside, and so it showed a dynamic relationship between the individual and their world. And when you go into psychosis, at least in my experience, I certainly can't speak for everybody who's ever been in psychosis because it's such a varied experience. But for me, anyway, and for most of the people that I've talked to who've gone through it, there's a definite sense of synchronicity. And it's like synchronicity takes over your life. Everything becomes really meaningful. That meaning might be positive or negative, and in fact, it's usually an extreme of one or the other. It can be very heavenly, but it can also be very infernal, very dark. But there's this sense in which what's going on internally and what's happening around you are connected, like very connected. And so you can think something, and then something will happen. That somebody will make a noise, or there'll be a sharp rap on the window, and it could be the wind, it could be anything, and most people, a person in an ordinary state of consciousness who experienced that would just go, oh, well, that was just a thing that happened, it was just a coincidence or whatever it was. But somebody in psychosis is going to find meaning in all of that, right? They're going to find something to internally interpret as a narrative, as a reality, as a structure. And so, what is your reality? Is your reality are you living in a world that's governed by physical laws and that are predictable? Are you living in a world that maybe you feel like you're living on a space station? Maybe you feel like your reality is dark and hellish. Maybe there's all these overarching sort of meanings that get added on, and so events that happen around you reflect that narrative. That narrative structure. It's basically an ontology, like a definition of what's real. And so you get this new layer of that, and then everything that occurs around you synchronistically adds up to furthering that idea of what your reality is, and sort of the narrative that you're part of, where you fit into that reality, becomes very, very important. So I would say that basically the first lesson you learn when you go into psychosis is that reality is fluid, and reality reacts or responds or in some way reflects your internal processes. It reflects your thoughts. It reflects your emotions. It's that there's a correspondence between these two. And there's an alchemical saying, in Western esotericism or Western alchemy, there's the idea of as above, so below. As it is done in heaven, so it is done on earth. As above, so below. As within, so without, and vice versa. And there's a sense of correspondence, and these are very much talked about in esoteric circles and alchemical circles. Carl Jung was very knowledgeable about this sort of thing. This also corresponds with the idea of magic in both in esoteric circles, but also in mythology. One of the best definitions of magic in fantasy and science fiction, speculative fiction, that I've ever run across was one by Ted Chiang, and he said that magic is in some sense the idea that the universe knows who you are as a person, and responds accordingly. And I think there's a lot of truth to that. And so it very much feels like you are in relationship with the universe in a very direct and visceral way, the same way you might have a relationship with another person. And so the state of your relationship changes the state of your world, and so reality is a fluid thing. And at least it is in psychosis. It certainly feels that way. And that's kind of a threatening concept, I suppose, if you're attached to the idea of a fixed and stable reality, which I think most of us are. This is why it's so disturbing for somebody in psychosis, because everything's falling apart and anything can happen, and so you really wonder what's safe, that there's so much uncertainty. You don't know what your world is going to look like from one moment to the next, and that can be really jarring and very frightening, a very intimidating thing, because again, anything can happen. And it doesn't always care about you, or at least you don't always feel like it does. And so that's kind of the darker end of things, or maybe it does care about you very much, and that's kind of the lighter end of things. But that sense of care, Einstein asked, or he said, that the most important question you can ask in life is whether or not you believe you're living in a benevolent universe or one that is hostile or indifferent, and I think that's a question that really characterizes psychosis as well, because that's a fundamental ontological question. Is the universe more or less geared toward your betterment and survival, your evolution as a person, your growth, your well-being, and all these things? And generally it is, because we're here and we generally have an understanding of what's healthy, and most of us, most of the time, manage to live in good health, at least well enough to reproduce, and so on it goes, But in psychosis, that question really comes up a lot. So not only is your reality fluid, but you have to answer the question. You have to respond to the question of whether or not you believe it's hostile or benevolent. And that really can influence things. So what does that mean? What does that fundamentally mean? And the conclusion that I came to, which was much more difficult in my most recent psychosis, because it was so dark. It was so fraught with guilt and shame and frustration and a lot of negative emotion, and so it was a very dark and negative experience. And I will do a video, probably a few videos, where I talk about the content of that in much more detail. But in my first psychosis, I had this sense that if reality is fluid, then what can I sort of hang my hat on? What can I what can I rely on? And that idea, like what came to me was the idea that love is all that's real, and that makes sense, because that answers the question of whether or not the universe is benevolent or hostile. If we come from the fundamental assumption that love is all that's real, then at least you know that you can rely on that. And this is where it gets tricky, because you can't necessarily rely on the love of your environment. It's not that other people are necessarily going to love you, but that you can embody a state of love. You can create love. You can express compassion. You can express appreciation for the world around you. You can get into that state, and the tendency in a psychosis experience, at least, I'm going to say this tentatively because I'm not 100% sure, because again, my recent experience was so dark, but there's this sense in which that is reflected to you. So the more you embody love, the more that you can embody a state of compassion, appreciation, gratitude, positive affect and emotion. As much as you can find positive meaning in the things around you and in what's going on internally, and as much as you can put that into the world, then that seems to come back. There seems to be a sense of it. That can be very hard to get to when you're really afraid, when some deep part of your psyche thinks that the universe is fundamentally unsafe. That's really hard to get to. So it is a bit of a choice that you have to make, but I think it's a good choice. I think it's one that makes sense, because love really fundamentally is the source of all meaning, the center of all meaning in life. When we ask, what is the meaning of life, which is a question you're definitely asking in Psychosis, what does my life mean? What's it all about? What not only what is everything, what am I, and where do I fit into that? What do I do about it? Then it comes back to love. It comes back to doing something that you believe will foster the growth of the world around you, to make the world, not to make it better, not to fix the world, but to just to pour your being into it, to pour as much light and as much love and as much goodness as you can into things. And that seems to be what really makes life meaningful, not even when you're not in psychosis, but especially when you're in psychosis, like to try to find that, is kind of what really makes sense of the experience, and it gives you a compass. It gives you something to aim toward, and it brings meaning to the experience, and that can be an experience that grows, rather than just an experience that destroys you or flattens you and rips your ego to shreds and just leaves you high and dry, and again, there's so much choice wrapped up into that. Sometimes that can be so hard to just see that you just have to decide it, but reality is fluid. At least it is in Psychosis, and so you do have the power to do that. And in making sense of these experiences for myself, that's the conclusion that I've come to. Reality is fluid, it's what you make it. And so love is all that's real. And in some sense, that relates to theological perspectives. What is God? Who is God? It's like everything is God or Godness, something like that. The reality itself is this expression of divinity, like it's magical and it's majestic in some sense, and it's loving, and if you can kind of connect with that, then that carries you through, and again, this doesn't matter whether or not you're in psychosis or not. If you're in an ordinary state of consciousness, this is also something that carries you through when things are otherwise dark and frightening, and that doesn't mean you have to believe in any particular spirituality or anything like that. I just find for me that believing that the mystery is benevolent, is it's a survival skill as much as it is an ontological choice or a theological choice or any system of belief or anything like that. It's much more fundamental than that. It's a basic attitude towards existence, and so that's something positive that I can take from my psychosis experiences and that I can share with the world. And hopefully, in sharing this, I've given you something that maybe just brightens your day a little bit, or whatever. So I hope it does. That's pretty much all I have to say about this at this particular time. But yeah, I'll leave you with that. Thank you so much for joining me.